Okay, today's project is we're going to install a steering rack brace kit, which is made for the 9.3, which was made from the classic 9.3, made from 99 through 02, and also the 03 convertible. Also, the kit can fit later 900s. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But before we get into the install of this steering rack brace kit, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about my car and about Saabs in general, and about why this steering rack brace kit is needed in certain circumstances and why it may be right for you. So let's talk about that. Now this car here is a 2001 9.3 convertible that I picked up this past summer, and this car is extremely fast. It's got the high output turbo, they sometimes call HOT, H-O-T, as well as the previous owner. He had a performance engine control unit put in, and also performance exhaust, and really this car runs like a scared rabbit. First time I became acquainted with just how fast a 4-cylinder Saab can run was back in the 90s. A place I worked at, a customer had a 9000 Aero, a doctor, and he did a lot of little performance tweaks to it, such as engine control unit and exhaust and things. And I had opportunity to drive that car on some country roads, and I was really dumbfounded at just how fast that car was. I was really impressed, the amount of power you can get out of a 4-cylinder engine, the way Saab has engineered the turbo. In fact, they had put together a 9.3 for climbing, one of these 9.3s, the classic 9.3, for climbing Pikes Peak. They made an all-wheel drive version. Of course, it was very heavily modified, but that 4-cylinder engine put out 750 horsepower, just to give you an idea of the potential output from these engines. You know, I've driven a lot of cars. I've owned, back in the day, I owned a number of muscle cars. Places I've worked at, I've driven exotic cars, high-performance cars. So I've driven a lot of fast cars, and this Saab is really very respectable. Now that's leading up to the steering rack brace kit, because this car actually, it's got too much horsepower for the front suspension, being front-wheel drive. What happens if you ease into it and take off? I mean, this car just goes. But if you punch it too quickly, really put your foot into it quickly, these cars will have a heavy torque steer, really rather unpleasant. Yeah, the torque steer very heavy on these. Now this was a problem with the 9.3 performance model. For these 9.3s, wasn't an Aero, but they called it a Viggen, and they had these torque steer problems. So a company, Abbott Racing, I don't know if they're the first ones to come up with it, but they did come up with what they called a Viggen Rescue kit. And part of that kit is, this isn't from Abbott Racing, but this is very similar to what they came up with here, the steering rack brace kit. And from everything I've been able to see online about it, reading different blogs and everything, this is the biggest bang for your buck. The Abbott Racing kit has this part of it, as well as some bushings and some other things, but this specific part, the steering rack brace kit, has the biggest effect on the torque steer. Many comments I've read say that it reduced it about 90%, made a significant difference in the feel of the steering of the car. And the reason for it is can look down here, see the mount bracket on the passenger side on the steering rack there. You see it's mounted in rubber, a thick rubber there, and you get quite a bit of movement in that. And another thing that can happen, and this is really the two reasons for installing the steering rack brace kit, is first of all the severe torque steer, and I haven't seen it, but many have reported having the firewall crack where the steering rack is bolted to the firewall, and you certainly don't want to have your firewall crack. So if you just got a regular driver without high output power, you probably really don't need this. But if you've got extra horsepower, this seems like a really good idea. So that's just a little bit of background on this. So let's see about the install now. Now, just another thing on the one I picked up, I got it from Euro Parts. You know, reasonable price, $125. I know the Abbott Racing kit that includes more things is fairly expensive. Now, if money's no object and you have the ability, or you know somebody that you trust to put it on there, then I would say go for that. But if you're looking for the biggest bang for your buck, to reduce this torque steer significantly, then everything I've read, that this is the way to go. Now, the thing with this Euro Parts, one thing I really didn't appreciate was, you know, I opened the box and there's no instructions. I mean, I know this isn't a real complex thing to put in, but you've got a number of parts here. You've got this bolt, this special nut, of course your replacement mount, and this bracket that will attach from your steering rack bracket to the inner fender. Now, the thing about it, just a little diagram and a couple steps to let you know specifically what this bolt is for, because I really don't know if this is to be used to bolt to the inner fender, or if they want to use it with this nut, or if they're replacing the bolt on the firewall with this. You know, so it would be helpful to have a little bit of information. Now, I looked on their website and their blog, and I couldn't find, I did search, I found no information about how to put this in. They do have a phone number, but I'd really rather not call. I know I have enough ability to figure this out and put it in, but it would have been nice to, you know, have them just include a one-page sheet of instructions with it, and I would have appreciated that. Saved me some time. So I ended up going online, read some different blogs, found some different information about it, and it kind of get me on the right track. But still, the specificness of what they gave me, I'm just going to have to explore a little bit. And that'll be the benefit, hopefully, for everybody that watches this video. Then you won't have to go through what I go through, but I'll be able to show you the proper way to install this, and you can just get right to it. So let's begin. Okay, let me show you an issue here. Read conflicting things online, and again, this is where it'd be helpful to have instructions. But if you look down here, my hand is your inner tie rod link from your steering rack to your outer tie rod end. And what's going to happen, you've got your opening down here where it travels through the inner fender, and as your suspension rides up and down, the issue is contact with this bar. And I've heard some say about some kits not having a bend. Now, this has a slight bend here, and this lines up perfectly with the forward hole. I don't know if you can see this. The opening has a splash shield, a rubber splash shield, and it's held on by plastic push pins. And that's where you're supposed to remove one of the plastic push pins and drill out the hole a little bit and bolt it to there, to the shock tower here. Now this, once the other top half of this bracket is on here, this lines up perfectly on the top. The issue you might run into in an extreme situation, I've got the car, I had it up on jack stands, but now I've got it back down on the floor, so the tie rod end is at riding height right now. If you really were to bottom out, because this bar is slightly below the ultimate height of this hole, and so theoretically I think, which some people ran into, if you were to bottom out your front suspension, it could hit this bar. Now the other option would have been putting it on the bottom of the bracket, and then there's a lower push pin hole that it lines up, seems to line up with perfectly down there. Now the issue I thought about doing that, putting it on the bottom, because I've read some say it goes on the bottom, on the stud. See, there's a bolt on the top and a stud on the bottom here for the bracket. Now the issue with that is when I had it up on jack stands and the front wheel is hanging, this the inner tie rod end here actually interfering already with the bar. So if you were to put your car on a lift, for example, now you would have this tie rod end laying on this bar, perhaps bending it, but in any case, it would be suspending the right front wheel by means of the tie rod, inner tie rod resting on this bar. And I really don't like that idea, and so I'm going to go with the top, basically. So let me just show you a few other things over here. Okay, let me show you what I've got here. Here's the old, this is just interesting in itself, here's the old, you see how fat this rubber is? It's awful a lot of squish there, so a lot of movement could be in that rack. I've heard it said in a blog, I don't know the truth of it, but the early 900s, they had, well, I know the truth of that, they did have a different style rack. Then I believe they went to a Saginaw rack in mid-96 on the 900s. The other rack was a bigger diameter, so the rubber was thinner. So they say what they did is Saab kept the same bracket here and just made a bigger rubber bushing. And so some are saying that gave it more mushiness there. But in any case, so just a few details here. The old bracket, it rests on there's a stud and a nut on the bottom, and here's the factory bolt that was on the top. Everything came out real easy, no problem there. So this special, I've got the inner half of this new. See what it replaces? You no longer have the rubber. What you've got is this alloy, the two halves, an inner half and an outer half that wrap around the rack. And what they made for the bottom to go over the stud is this special nut, and you'll see there's a bigger hole in your bracket here. So that's the one that's got to go on. This has to go on the stud on the bottom, and it'll go through the two pieces, and you tighten it down the stud. Now you notice there's well, never mind that. But anyways, that's got to go on the bottom. And then I pretty much surmised that because this is thicker, you needed a bolt for the top, which is slightly longer than the factory bolt. So I think that's why they give you this. See, they never really said, but this is clearly for the bottom. And then this could have been used for the end going to the fender, but they don't give you a nut. I'm really have to assume that because this comes up a little shorter than I'd like it on the top, going through these two thicker pieces than this. I have to believe that they gave you this to go in the top. So with that in mind, where this attaches to the shock tower inner fender, you've got to come up with your own bolt. And so I had this in my toolbox. So it's got a lock backing there. What I had to do is, this fits perfectly in here. Now what I had to do is, when I took out here's one of your push pins. This is just the tool that works nice for taking these out, but you can use anything that works for you to get under there and pop that out. Now the hole was slightly too small, and I saw that online too. Ones mentioned drilling it out. So to get up to this size, I used a 5/16 drill bit, which made a perfect size for this metric bolt here, the 13 millimeter. And so I'm going to use that to attach it to the fender. The other issue with that, there's that rubber dust thing held on by these push pins. So now when you tighten this down, do you cut away the rubber and have this flush on the metal? Do you bolt it down right on the rubber? I'm just going to bolt it down right on the rubber. Mush it down. See how that works. Snug it up there. And go with that. So I pretty much figure that I've got this figured out now. I'm going to go ahead and finish the install, and then we'll check back in here. I thought I'd show you something before I finish putting this in. Usually I'm an advocate of get everything started loosely. You know, have the top bolt, I would have like this top bolt started, the nut on the bottom, which I do. I don't have it snugged up all the way. And then the bolt down here to the shock tower inner fender, have that loose. Well, what I found, interestingly enough, to get this one to line up here, this upper bolt into the firewall, I needed to snug this up quite a bit to get it. So now I believe I've just stuck the bolt in there. Now it looks like it lines up nice, and I should have no trouble threading that in there. And then I will go with my usual practice, because I haven't torqued this down fully yet, but I had to snug it up more than I normally would just to get this to line up. So that's a little tip there. And while I've got the video here with this, another little tip with taking out the original bracket here that goes over the rubber. Once you take the nut off the bottom stud, take the bolt out the top, you'll find it doesn't want to come out because it hits your power steering line here. Just a little tip. Tilt it this way. Take the bottom part off the stud first, and then once you've got it off the stud, you can just maneuver it and get it right out of there. But what happens if it's on the stud and you try to maneuver and get it out of there, you're not going to do it. So just tilt it up, get it off the stud, and get the original one off that way. Putting the new one is really no problem. There's some movement on the rack. When this mount is off, you can move the rack a little bit, and it's easy enough to slip the new bracket in there. So I want to go ahead and snug everything up now, and then have a little conclusion. One thing I wanted to point out while I was doing this, I don't know if you can see here, the end of the steering rack here, there's some rust. The paint has started to blister and it's rusting. And I noticed the other end of the steering rack, the same thing is happening. Now this is something that, particularly you're going to notice this on a northern car, and then just even in general. I mean, this car is an '01, so you're looking at 16, 17 years old at at the time of this video, so you're going to start getting some rust. But this, from my experience, I have actually seen these rust. This is nothing. I've seen these rust to the point where it actually springs a power steering leak here, and your steering rack is no good. Not only is the rack no good, it's no good as a core either to be rebuilt, because it actually will, I don't know how thick the metal is here, but it will rust enough to actually get into the fluid. I've seen these leak. I've had to change a steering rack on one of these due to this rusting out. So it's something I always look at, and I'm going to treat this one way or the other. I'll treat this to stop this rust. So it's a good. I wanted to point that out while I was doing this. I meant to do that because just from experience, it's something that you definitely want to give attention to. Check your car. You've got a 9.3, classic 9.3. Check these out. Look for that rust and catch it early before you ever get to anywhere near the point where you have a problem where you're going to have to change that steering rack. Okay, I've got everything snugged up now. I think it came out real nice. Even looks nice in there, that nice blue bar and the new nuts on there. So once you know what to do, this job, goodness, it shouldn't take any more than a half an hour to do this. Really, there's not that much to it. It's not hard to get at, and you just take off that old mount, drill out the hole here after you remove the push pin, and get everything started, and that's it. Now, just a couple final notes on things. Since you drill here, it's nice you got some bare metal, then it's nice to treat that hole with something to keep it from rusting before you put your bolt in there. And then now this is an American Saab, so it's a left-hand drive car, and so you're putting this bracket on the right side of the car, the passenger side. Now, so the opposite is true. If you have a right-hand drive car, such as in Britain, this is going to be on the left side of the car. Then it's going to be on the passenger side. So this always goes on the passenger side, the kit, and I believe it's a different kit for the for the right-hand drive car. I'm pretty sure it's a different kit, so you have to specify. But basically, it'll go on the same way. And I saw on a blog about it. If you search, you may be able to find it. They have some nice pictures. But on the ABS unit is still on that side of the car, on a right-hand drive car, and there's a bracket for the ABS unit that apparently bolts right to where that opening is in the fender well. And it says in the blog, you just remove the bolt for the bracket for the ABS unit, and that's where you're going to bolt the new rack kit to on your inner fender. So I wish I could drive it, but I'm actually in the middle of some other work on the car, and so it's going to be a little bit before I get out on the road and test this out. But at that time, I'll give you some feedback in another video as to my impressions of how it feels, how it's changed the car. Hopefully, it does just as all the various online information that I found says, that pretty much unanimous that it tremendously reduces the torque steer. Not completely eliminate it, but really reduces it, like 90%. And so that sounds like, as I mentioned earlier, the best bang for your buck as far as Viggen Rescue kit. Or you could go all the way and do the full treatment with the Abbott Racing. As I mentioned earlier, I got this kit from E-Euro Sports. $125. And I saw some other ones online here or there. The quality on this one looked good, and you know, the only thing I didn't like was that they didn't give instructions with it. Just a one-page instructions would really help, because I had to basically figure things out by looking online and then looking at the car. But the bar does line right up perfectly with the hole in the inner fender there on the strut tower, and with the upper bolt on the bracket for the rack. So they did a nice job on that, you know, making the bar and welding it, and so it looks like a nice quality kit. I have to say I can recommend it. I would recommend it, and hopefully they'll start putting some instructions in there. So that's the project for today. Hope this helps you.